The urllib parse module defines a standard interface to manipulate URL strings. It allows us to break up a URL into its components, to combine the components back into a single URL string, and to convert a relative URL to an absolute URL. It supports several URL schemes, including HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, and file. So the general structure of an absolute URL is scheme, followed by the host name, followed by the path. We have optional parameters, a query, and possibly a fragment. So here's an example. The scheme identifies the protocol to be used. The scheme in our example is HTTP. The host name is also known as the domain or network location. That's sjsu.edu in our example. The path refers to the specific resource within the host that we want to access. In this case, our path is admissions. There are no parameters specified in our example. The query is usually a string of name and value pairs that will be passed to the resource. There is no query specified here, and we don't have a fragment either. Now, the URL parse function within the parse module parses the URL into 6 components. Each component is a string. It could possibly be empty. Let's try URL parse in PyCharm. So we first import urllib parse. Let's use this SJSU newsroom URL as our example. Let's call URL parse from the parse module on it. Let's see what kind of return value URL parse returns. We get a parse result object. Let's print it. So URL parse returns an object with 6 components. We can access each component by its name. We can print the scheme, the network location, that's also the host name, the path, that's newsroom, the parameters. There are no parameters in this URL, so nothing is printed. We can print the query. Our query is s equals virus. And finally, we print the fragment, and there's no fragment here, so nothing is printed. There are 2 types of URLs that we'll be dealing with when we crawl the web. There are absolute URLs and there are relative URLs. So absolute and relative URLs are similar to absolute and relative file names. Absolute URLs contain more information, but relative URLs are convenient and more portable. So relative URLs are relative to the host name of some base URL. The base URL is the URL we are currently at. Note that we only use the host name of the base URL to compute the absolute URL. If the base URL includes a path, we ignore that path. We only take the host name from the base URL, and then we construct our relative URL. When links are on different servers, we have to use absolute URLs. There's no choice in that. Let's see how all this works with an example. Let's go to the web page http://iea.sjsu.edu/reports. If we click on View Page Source to view the HTML for that page, we see several links. Links in HTML are stored as attribute values on various kinds of tags. We'll just consider links contained in anchor tags, A tags for now. So anchor tags have this attribute named href that points to the linked URL. This linked URL is an absolute URL. Absolute URLs include the scheme and the host name. Of course, they may also include a path, parameters, a query, and a fragment. And this link over here is a relative URL. It does not include the scheme or the host name. It starts from the path. Let's go to PyCharm and use URL join to construct the absolute URLs for each of these links. So we first import urllib.parse. Let's first use URL join to construct the absolute URL corresponding to our relative URL. Remember that since all these links are found on http://iea.sjsu.edu/reports, that URL is our base. Now we call URL join in the urllib parse module, and we pass our relative URL as well as our base. URL join constructs and returns the corresponding absolute URL. Note that only the domain name from the base URL is included. The path is ignored. Let's do the same for our second link found on our base URL. This is already an absolute link. URL join works even if we give it an absolute URL. It recognizes it as an absolute URL and returns it as it is. This is convenient because we don't have to do any pre-processing before we call URL join. We can call it with any URL, absolute or relative, that we encounter and be certain that we are getting back an absolute URL.